Hello. In this video, I'm going to talk about a very interesting area of brand management, which is brand authenticity. Now, this is a very interesting and a new concept. And when we look at authenticity as such, every brand manager, every marketer would like to have their brand to be considered authentic. Now, what is authenticity? If you look at the dictionary meaning, authenticity is essentially the quality of being real or true, which is defined as in Cambridge Dictionary, while Merriam-Webster defines authentic or authenticity as something that is worthy of acceptance or belief as conforming to or based on fact. So essentially, if you look at the meaning of authenticity, this is all about being genuine. Okay. Uh, so this is a very important construct as far as consumers are concerned. Okay, consumers like their brand to be genuine. So when you look at converting this concept of authenticity into branding, how do the academicians and researchers consider this concept? Now, brand authenticity is the outcome of the connection of authenticity to a brand. And when we look at the concept of brand authenticity, brands are essentially non-living entities. So how can a non-living entity have a value like genuineness or true to itself? So here, whenever we talk about these concepts, we talk about perception, how the consumer perceive a brand to be authentic. So rather than talking about brand authenticity, marketers essentially talk about perceived brand authenticity. So uh, how consumers perceive a brand to be authentic. So consumers perception. And as we all know, marketers or brand managers' role is to build or create positive perception uh, in the mind of the consumer. And let us look at how academicians and researchers define or literature defines brand authenticity. So, brand authenticity is it's a definition which I find it very interesting. The extent to which consumers perceive a brand to be faithful towards itself, true to its consumers, motivated by caring and responsibility, and able to support consumers in being true to themselves. So, there are certain important elements in this definition which we call as dimensions. Okay, so if you look at the elements of brand authenticity, one is of course continuity, second is credibility, third is integrity, and fourth is symbolism. So when a brand has all these elements, consumers perceive this brand as authentic. So the question comes as to how can a marketer build an authentic brand, and it is not easy. It's a very difficult process. It takes a lot of time. And when we look at building brand authenticity, we have to understand what are the dimensions or I would say building blocks of brand authenticity. So when we look at the earlier definition, the authors have given very important four building blocks of brand authenticity. The first one being continuity. What do you mean by continuity? Now, continuity essentially talks about consistency. Okay, so the brand being consistent Consistent of what? Consistent in terms of what it delivers. Okay. So a brand is considered to be authentic when it is consistent, when it is able to transcend time. Certain brands are timeless, brands which have a lot of history. Researchers have found that brands which have a legacy or a historical legacy is considered to be more authentic by the consumers. So a brand needs to be consistent. A brand needs to transcend time. A brand needs to have a history. And when you talk about transcending time, this is how you survive the various trends. Okay, there are brands which are able to survive uh, technology, the time. There are brands which are 100 years old. There are brands in the technology domain which is able to survive all the drastic changes that are happening in technology, and these are considered to be or perceived to be authentic by the consumers. Second dimension which the author talks about is the credibility. Now, what do you mean by credibility of a brand? This is something which is which we all know what is credibility, whether how reliable the brand is, whether the consumers are able to trust the brand. Okay, so that becomes very very important when we talk about building brand authenticity. And the third is about the integrity. Now this is where the intention of the brand becomes very very important. Now again, when we talk about intention, this is all about perception. Okay, whether the consumers perceived the brand to have a positive intention. Okay, the brand is there, the brand is genuine, the brand has certain value systems. Okay, uh, and that value system is beneficial to the customer. The customer perceives that the brand has a value system, and how it all translate is that it all translate into action, and the brand is able to act in a right manner. And when you look at integrity, one of the most important aspect of integrity is the value. So every brand which are very authentic has certain solid value system uh, running behind it, and this value system is reflected in the action, and action is of course uh, with a good intention, and that influences customer perception. So this is actually a cycle, and as we all know, all this takes a lot of time to develop. Okay, and then according to the authors, another important dimension of brand authenticity is symbolism. So what is symbolism? Now, symbolism is a difficult construct, I would say, and it is directly related with the image. It talks about brand image. So how well the brand is able to connect with the self image of the consumers. Okay. Every consumer has self image, and how well the brand is able to connect its image with the self image of the consumer. So when we talk about self image, uh, there are two kinds of self image. One is the actual self image, and another self image or type of self image is the aspirational self image. Research have proved or suggested that when you are building authenticity, your brand's image should connect to the actual self image. of the consumer rather than the aspirational self-image of the consumer. So that is very important, because essentially brand authenticity is all about being true to itself, right? Itself. So you need to connect the image of the brand to the actual self image of the uh, consumer. And as we all know, there are a lot of reasons why consumer choose brand, and one of the reason that consumers choose brand is to uh, project an image, project themselves. So now when you wear a brand, you are again trying to project either your aspirational self image or your actual self image to others. Okay, so this becomes very important. So when you are building authenticity into your brand, you need to provide the consumer a resource. Okay, so your brand will be a resource through which the consumers will try to define who they are. Okay, so this is very important when we are talking about brand authenticity. So when I read through the various literature on brand authenticity, I thought that these four dimensions are one of the best way that you can understand the concept of authenticity, and this gives a lot of very important pointers on building uh, authenticity to your brand. There are also other studies which looked at the dimensions of brand authenticity. There is a study which talks about the dimensions as originality, reliability, and naturalness as dimensions, and you can see that all these three dimensions are almost similar to the dimensions which we have described earlier. And originality, one of the differences is that when the researchers talked about originality, they meant how different the brand is compared to the competitors. Uh, Reliability talks about promise. What is a promise and how it is being delivered. And naturalness is all about being genuineness or not artificial. Okay. Uh, so when we look at these dimensions of brand authenticity, one of the things that stand out of this dimension is the brand's ability to be very genuine. Okay, be true to itself. And how do you become true to yourself is, of course, you look at building these critical dimensions. And of course there are a lot of other research literature which talks about a lot of different dimensions. And one of the reasons why there is lack of consensus in terms of dimensions of brand authenticity is that the dimensions depend a lot on the context under which the brand operates. It varies with the category under which the brand operates. So when you are looking at an industry like beer industry, where a lot of studies on authenticity has been conducted, it will be totally different from the dimensions of authenticity when you are looking at another category like FMCG. And another important uh, I would say that a factor that you have to consider while building brand authenticity is that authenticity is very much connected with the history of the brand. Okay, so research says that when a brand has a rich history or a legacy, then you can build brand authenticity better. Why? Because there are researchers which talks about nostalgia as an antecedent of brand authenticity. So if your brand is able to create a nostalgic feeling in the mind of the customer, then the brand can build authenticity in the mind of the customer. So recently in the Indian market, you can see that a lot of old brands have been rejuvenated, uh, or uh, or relaunched, or relaunched. Why? Because it brings about certain nostalgia, and since there is a history of the brand, it is very easy to build brand authenticity. Okay. And in the case of service brands, the employees are very critical in building authenticity. Now, why? Because if you look at the service brand, the delivery usually happens through the employees, and how the employees behave has very strong influence on the authenticity. And there are a lot of literature which also talks about brand clarity as an important antecedent of brand authenticity. That is, it's all about how a brand communicates to the customer. So when you want to build brand authenticity, make sure that your communication is very clear in terms of positioning, image, and values. So when a brand is very clear about the positioning, image, and the values, consumers tend to perceive the brand to be authentic. Okay. And when we look at brand authenticity, the history, legacy, there are also certain researchers which suggest that now brand social commitment is an important element when which can help in building authenticity. Now, so you can see that this is directly connected with the value system, and brands which are perceived to be socially relevant and perceived to have a commitment is considered to be more authentic by the consumers. So when I looked at the literature of concerning brand authenticity, now it's very clear that it takes a lot of time for brands to build authenticity, because there is a customer looks at the consistency, the credibility, the value system, which all takes a lot of time to build. So how this is important to marketeer? The concept of brand authenticity should be woven into the brand values. Okay, uh, the marketeer should essentially be very clear about the brand values. It should again be very clear in the communication to the customers. Okay, and this brand values should be socially relevant. And also another important aspect is that you should look for a fit between the brand values and the consumer. Okay, consumer tends to view brands as authentic when the values that the brand projects fits with the consumers self image or their own perception about the values. So this is also very important when you are trying to build brand authenticity. So when you look at brand authenticity uh, as a variable, it's a very interesting variable in terms of academic research. At the same time, this is also important when we are looking at building brands for the long term. Uh, and researchers have established that brands which are very highly authentic, builds loyalty, okay, commands price premium, and is able to survive uh, price competition. So it makes sense to put in an effort, put in a long-term strategy and action plan to build brand authenticity. So this presentation is, of course, derived from my uh, reading of various articles and as well as my own observation about the various marketing practices that is happening across the branding spectrum. So thank you for listening.